Welcome to this short podcast which looks at population. The aim is to provide information and to encourage you to ask questions and to discuss with others some of the ideas that we have about population change. So let's get started. Two ways of looking at demographic changes are commonly used, either by plotting graphs of death rates and birth rates over a period of time, or by looking at snapshots of population pyramids at specific points in time. Whichever method we choose, we can observe a number of trends. Over the last 200 years in developed countries, the death rate fell, followed by the birth rate. The lapse of time between these two events producing an increase in the overall population of the country. The fall in birth rates tended to stabilise, and so then population grew slowly, and in some countries even contracted, when fertility rate failed to reach replacement rate. Can we trace this pattern for a typical town in the northwest of England? And can we discover anything that leads us to suggest reasons for the fall in death rates and in birth rates? Economists tell us that both events are a result of an increase in wealth and of rising GDP. Is the answer really that simple? One way of looking at this is to consider the increase in population and the fall in death rate and look at all the events during that period. So look at these figures for the United Kingdom. What do you think causes population change? There are four factors here to consider: birth rates, death rates, inward migration, outward migration. Over the last decade in the UK, we can see that births have exceeded deaths, and that natural population growth is increasing. At the same time, net migration is also increasing, resulting in overall population growth. So, is this a slowing of growth? Is the population stable? From the figures here, we can say that the population is certainly not contracting. But what else can we deduce? The UK population pyramid shows a small widening at the base. We can also see the upper part does not taper. What does this suggest about number of births? And what does it tell us about the numbers of older people? It indicates an increasing number of older people. But what about those birth rates? How does our town in the north of England compare? There are 2 points that I notice. The first is that the base of this pyramid is narrowing. Birth rates do seem to be falling. The second is that there is a significant contraction in numbers between the ages of 20 to 30 years, which is also reflected to some extent in the national pyramid. So why should birth rates in this town be falling while the national figure is showing an increase? And how do we account for that great big chunk that seems to be missing from age 20 to 40 years? Does the tapering at the top of the pyramid suggest anything about life expectancy? Now consider the projection at national level for the next 25 years. Why do you think the total area of the pyramid is larger? Does this suggest an increase or a decrease in population? The total population is increasing, which is why the area of the pyramid is larger. The peak is higher, and this increase in area near the peak reflects an aging population. The base suggests birth rates are likely to stabilise. What about our local town? Does this pyramid appear to have the same shape as the national projection? I don't think it does. The bulge between 20 to 30 years, apparent on the national picture, is not present here. Why might this be? What we are seeing is a picture of local variation, and we may be able to find explanations for such variances. We can then think about how local variances might affect some of the national projections. Let us look at the local population change over the past 2 centuries. When did the population start to increase rapidly? Do you think birth rates were rising or falling at this time? There are some trends here. First, there was no rapid population increase until around 1860. Then the growth was rapid until the start of the 20th century. Since then there has been a steady fall in population, although the slight blip may actually be the result of boundary changes. If I told you that the birth rate fell between 1850 and 1900, how would you explain the population growth? I want to examine two ideas here. The first is that we currently have a decline in the local population. The usual explanation would be that this is the result of a mature population pattern, of the effect of increasing wealth. Here, if you read, the council leader suggests something else. He believes the decline is due to young people leaving the area. This picture is reflected in some other areas of the UK. Note that half of these areas are in the northwest of England. Do you think there are any other characteristics that these areas might share? Do you think they have large numbers of wealthy people? However, in the case of our small town, we have something else that is conspicuous. The fall in population here contrasts with surrounding areas. So, can we identify any possible linked factors here? Our first clue comes from a study of life expectancy. The life expectancy for those living in the town is significantly lower than the national average. What are the factors that we associate with a lower life expectancy? You might have thought in terms of poverty, health, housing conditions, and types of employment. You have almost certainly guessed that deprivation is important. The area is considered to be one of the most deprived areas in England. This raises some interesting questions. Population decline in developed countries may not necessarily be associated with increased wealth. This short illustration suggests it may actually be associated with deprivation and significantly reduced growth at a local level. Go back to the early part of the 20th century when population was highest in this town, with a thriving cotton industry, the mills making the town the largest producer of cotton cloth in Europe at the time. The decline of the industry and failure to develop alternative sources of employment has had an influence on population. I would suggest that this same pattern may also be seen in Detroit. A contracting automotive industry, high factors of deprivation, lowering of wealth, and a shrinking population. What other information would you like to see? I would want to go and research immigration into and out of the area. Why do you think I might want to do this? The 19th century shows high death and birth rates up until around 1850. Life expectancy in Burnley actually fell during the period 1800 to 1850, even though the Industrial Revolution was starting to take hold. The reason for this is probably the appalling conditions in the town at the time. These are some of the earlier terraces that were built during the second part of the 19th century, and in many streets there are builder stones that show the great increase in housing during that period. These may seem poor by the standards of today, but they represented a great improvement on the conditions of the previous half-century. The housing being built at this time shows some improvements. In this case, running water in the kitchen and a privy or toilet in the backyard. You can just about see this on the plans. There would have been a tap in the kitchen. Residents would no longer have to go out and seek the nearest pump. Question arises, if life expectancy in the town actually fell during the first part of the 19th century and birth and death rates were high, how might we account for this? Well, this is a brief snapshot of conditions reported by a social worker. What is the clue here for poor living conditions? At least one author has suggested that falling death rates were a result of public health expanding. How does the use of a vaccine help to reduce death rates? What effect will that have on an overall population? These mills brought wealth to their owners, but why did workers flock to the towns? What were the conditions like for children who worked in the mills? The safety standards were poor, with no requirements for guards for machinery. One picture that is painted is that of workers flocking into towns for increased wages in the large factories. How about looking at other changes locally? The enclosure of common land forced many workers to abandon country areas and seek employment in towns. Cottage industries, where yarn was spun and woven in homes, could not compete with factories, and the spinners and weavers had little choice but to go and seek work in the factories. What effect would abandoning the rural cottages have on the population in the country and in the town? Can you see now why it is important to consider migration? Times are changing. The work in the mills has gone. How do you think this affects migration? Often, as one industry falls away, a new industry emerges. There is little evidence of this here. In fact, not only did the mills close, but the colliery also closed. Can you make a prediction about unemployment in this area? Think about this image. Would you expect to see this in a wealthy area? It is, however, not all doom and gloom, and there are signs of regeneration. How will they affect the population? Well, it may be too early to say. So let us return to the first idea. Economists tell us that population changes can be explained by increases in wealth and of rising GDP, with developed countries moving towards a stable pattern and even population contraction. Is the answer really that simple? I don't think so, and I hope you will see that there can be variations locally that we need to think about. Why? If policy is based on the economist's view, then what happens if they are wrong? What happens when wealth is not evenly distributed? What is happening to the distribution of wealth in your area? I hope that you enjoyed this short presentation, and that you will now think carefully about your local town or area. Are there variables there that have influenced the patterns? And are those patterns in line with national projections?